Now we're going to talk about how to solve quadratics using what's called the square root method. Okay, so remember, when you're solving a quadratic, what you're really doing is finding where that, if you graphed it, where it would cross the x-axis. So one way that you could always check your answers is you could graph it and just make sure that, it matches up with where it crosses the x-axis. Okay, so if we were using the square root method to solve a quadratic equation, the first thing that you want to do is you want to get the squared part, whatever is being squared, by itself first, okay? So like if there's other things that are with anything that's being squared, you have to get it to the other side of the equal sign first. After that, once you have the squared part by itself, the opposite of squaring is to square root. So you're going to square root both sides of your equations. And after you actually do that, you have to kind of remember that that's going to give you two answers. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It's going to actually give you a positive and a negative answer. So you have to remember to put a plus or minus in front of what you get when you simplify, okay? And then after that, you may have to solve from there. So that's the reason why I put if necessary, because you might already have your answers sometimes. But for other problems, you're going to have to actually solve it the rest of the way, okay? So now, when does the square root method work, okay? Because it's not going to always work. The only time that this method works when you're solving quadratics is if you are actually missing the bx term from that expression. So like if you had, the ax squared, and then you had the bx plus c, you actually want to be missing the bx part in order for this to work. So like if you had something like 3x squared minus 4x minus 2 equals 0, notice that has the bx term. That you cannot solve using this method because it has that bx term in it, okay? You cannot solve using the square root method. You might be able to use some other method, but you just can't use the square root method, okay? So you actually want to be missing the x term, okay? So like that can't be there to solve it this way. All right, so how do you solve it? Well, we're going to do some examples here. All right, so we're going to run through the steps. So whenever I'm looking at it, notice I have a quadratic because it's got an x squared in there. And if it says something like solve using the square root method, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get whatever is being squared by itself first, okay? So notice the x is being squared, so we're going to look at that side of the equation. So like if you look at it, that's the side, that the squared part's on, and notice it's by itself already. So we're already good with that first step. After that, then you actually start the solving part. So the opposite of squaring is square rooting, because you want to get the x by itself. So to get rid of the square, you actually square root, and then remember what you do to that side, you also have to do to the other side. So when you actually square root, what happens is the square root and the square cancel. So you're left with whatever is underneath the radical, which is an x. And then you simplify this. So what is the square root of 16? Well, it would be 4, but here's the deal. What you're really doing, so let's look back at the original equation here. What you're really doing is finding a number that when you square it, so remember squaring means that you're taking that number times itself 2 times, you get 16. And there's actually 2 numbers that when you square it, you get 16. If you take 4 times itself, that gives you 16. But what other number, if you take it times itself, gives you 16? And if you kind of sit there and think about it, you'll realize that if you take negative 4 times itself, negative 4, you also get 16. So that's what I was talking about over here, is for these problems, anytime that you are square rooting both sides of the equation, you're actually going to have 2 answers. You're going to have the positive version of that number you get and the negative. So to show that, you have to remember that to put a plus and a minus in front of your answer for these problems, okay? And that's one way of writing the answer. The other way, if you want to try to remember this, is you could write, okay, -4 and 4 will work, okay? So you could write it either way, but just make sure you remember it's got a positive and a negative answer there. So this would be an acceptable way of writing it, but this would also be acceptable, okay? And then remember, what we've really done is we found where this would cross the x-axis. So if we kind of quickly sketch this, it opens up because the number in front of x squared is positive, so it's going to open up. It's going to cross the x-axis at -4, and then it's going to cross it at 4. And so if we kind of sketched a graph of it, it would look something like that. Not exact, but it's a sketch, okay? So don't forget how it relates to the graph, okay? So let's do a couple more like this, okay? So we're going to just keep running through these steps to solve using the square root method. All right, so with this one, if I have to solve it using square root method, I'm going to get the squared part by itself, and then once I do that, I'm going to square root both sides. So notice the squared part is already by itself, so then I have to get rid of that square. So I'm going to square root, and I have to do it to both sides. So when I do that here, the square root and the square will cancel, and so I'm left with x. And then on this side, you got to figure out what the square root of 144 is. So what number times itself gives you 144? And that would be 12. But then remember, there's technically two numbers. If you take 12 and you square it, you'll get 144. But also if you take -12 and square it, you get 144. So there's a positive 12 and a negative 12 that would work there. So you could write it like that. Or remember, you could write it as -12 and 12 would work. Okay, so either way is fine. Okay, so let's keep going. So the next one, if you have to solve this one, same story. Get the squared part by itself, then you square root both sides. So notice with this one, the x is being squared, but now you have something else on the same side of the equals with it. So you want to get this to the other side before you can do the square root parts. If you forget to do that, you will mess the problem up, okay? So how do I get this -25 to the other side? Well, I just have to do the opposite. So because I'm subtracting, I'm going to add it to both sides. So then that x squared will come down. The -25 plus 25 goes away. And then on this side, I end up getting 25, because 0 plus 25 is 25. And now the squared part's by itself. So the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So you're going to square root both sides. So the square root and the square will cancel because they're opposites of each other. Okay, so you'd be left with x on that side. And then what is the square root of 25? Well, it would be 5, but remember, there's a positive and a negative that would work there, okay? So your answer would be 5 and -5, okay? So the next one, okay, same story. If you have to solve it with the square root method, one thing that you should always kind of be aware of is if you have to be missing the x term, so make sure you don't have the x term in there, okay? But we don't have the x term, we just have the x squared term and then the constant, so we're good there, okay? Get the squared part by itself first. So notice it's not by itself still, so we got to get that -75 to the other side, so we're going to add it. Okay, so then those will go away. I'll be left with x squared on this side, and then 0 plus 75 is 75, okay? Then you square root, and so the square root and the square will cancel. And then from there, that's going to be a decimal. It is okay to get decimals. It happens, okay? And so you square root 75, and you end up getting 8.66. But remember, there's two numbers that'll work. If you take 8.66 times 8.66, it'll give you 75. But also if you take -8.66 times -8.66, you'll get the 75 too. So don't forget to put your plus or minus. Anytime you square root, just remember to put your plus or minus, because there's technically two answers that work, okay? So the next one, what if you had something like this? Well, same story. The x squared part's not by itself, So I got to get it by itself. So I have to actually subtract my 64 to get it to the other side. So then 64 minus 64 goes away, and my x squared comes down. And then on this side, I end up getting negative 64. To get rid of the square, now it's by itself, so I'm going to square root both sides. And so the square root and the square will cancel. And then I'll be left with x is equal to, well, what number times itself gives you negative 64? And if you think about it, you're going to notice there's an issue here. And if you type it in a calculator, you're going to also notice there's an issue. Because think about it. What can you multiply times itself and check it that would give you a negative 64? And if you kind of check it and think about it, you'll notice that there is not a number that if you take it times itself gives you negative 64. A lot of people will tell me negative 8 would multiply by itself to give you negative 64, but I would ask them, what is a negative times a negative? It's going to be a positive. And so anytime you end up with a negative under the radical, that's going to give you what's called imaginary solutions, which you are going to learn about in the next class. But in this class, we just need to remember that this is going to give us solutions that are not real numbers. They're actually called imaginary numbers. So if this happens and you end up taking the square root of a negative, okay, so you can not take the square root of a negative. So if that happens, then what you're going to write for your answer is that it has no real solution. It will have solutions, but they're not going to be real solutions. Okay, so that would be your answer. So look out for that because it will happen. Okay, so you would put there's no real solution to that problem. Okay, so let's keep going. So the next one, look at what's being squared. This whole thing is being squared. So if that's happening, then what you're going to do is make sure that, remember, just like what we talked about up here, you got to get the squared part by itself. So this whole thing is the thing that's being squared. And notice there's nothing else on that side of the equal sign, so it's technically by itself. So if it's already by itself, then you can go ahead to the next thing. So because the squared part's by itself, now we can square root both sides of the equation. And now this one will work a little differently because you've got more than one thing underneath it. So just know that's going to happen, okay? But now that it's by itself, we took the square root, and the square root, remember, cancels out the square, so that just kind of goes away altogether, and then you just write down, like in the other problems, what's left under the radical. And then this one, you would end up getting the square root of 0, which is 0. Okay, and now technically it'd be a positive and a negative 0, like we talked about, but the only problem here is, well, positive 0 is 0, negative 0 is 0, so it's the same thing. So you're left with x minus 2 equals 0. And so you really just have that to solve. So this is what I was talking about is, excuse me, sometimes after you get your answer, you have to solve it afterwards. So this is one where we have to do something extra afterwards. So solve it. Well, to get x by itself, from here I have to add 2. And then these go away. And so I'm left with x is equal to 0 plus 2 is 2. Now, here's the deal though. Quadratics will usually have two places that they cross. So if it ends up just having one answer, these are going to be the ones that look like they kind of bounce off the x-axis. So if you look, the number that's in front of the x squared, if you actually multiplied this out, would be positive. So if I graphed this one, it's going to hit the x-axis at 2. But what it actually looks like, and you can graph it if you need to, is it's going to look like it kind of bounces off the x-axis. So these problems that just have one solution to them are just going to kind of bounce off of the x-axis. Okay, so it'll look something like that. All right, so the next one, look at the problem. If you have to solve it using the square root method, look at the part that's being squared and ask yourself, is it by itself? And notice for this problem, the squared part is the x minus 3. And if you look at kind of that side of the equals mark, it's not by itself because you got a minus 18. So what you're going to have to do first is get that 18 or that minus 18 to the other side. So the opposite of subtracting would be to add. So make sure you don't forget to get the squared part by itself. Then these would go away. And then you just bring down the x minus 3 squared. And then 0 plus 18 gives you 18. From there, you're going to look, okay, do I have my squared part by itself? And it is. So then, once the squared part is by itself, then you do the square root. So, and the reason you do the square root is to get rid of the square, and you have to do it to both sides. So the square root and the square will cancel. Then you write down what's left under the radical, which is an x minus 3. And now, on this side, it's going to be a decimal. That is okay. So what number times itself gives you 18? You could just type that in. Square root of 18 ends up being 4.24. And then remember, there's two different answers here. There's the positive 4.24, and then there's the negative 4.24 that would work. Okay, so do not forget to put the plus or minus in front of what you get when you square root it. Okay, now this is another problem where we have to do a little bit of solving afterwards. And this one, because there's two answers over here, or two numbers that are technically over here, you have to actually split this one up, because you're going to have to take, and kind of like what we did here where we solved, we only had one number it was equal to. Here, you have to take that x minus 3 and set it equal to the positive 4.24. But then it's also going to have to be set equal to the negative version of that answer too, because that's going to be the thing that gives you the two different answers that you typically end up with here. Okay, so don't forget, if it has to be solved the rest of the way and you end up having two different answers, you just split it up. You take it and equal it to the positive and then the negative, and then you solve. So from here I'd have to add my 3. So if I add my 3, see if I can squeeze it in here. For this one, x would equal the 7.24. So that's one place where it would cross the x-axis. And then here I'd have to add 3. And when I add 3 there, x would equal negative 1.24. So your answers here, it's going to cross, and remember I usually put them in numerical order, so it's going to cross at negative 1.24 on the x-axis and 7.24. So there would be my solutions to that problem. And so that's how you solve using the square root method.